All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Leslie Kirby and I'm the Vice President of the Jewish Federation and Jewish Foundation of Nashville and Middle Tennessee, and also the chair of our task force on Israel and domestic anti-Semitism. I'm delighted to have with us tonight Ari Dubin, who's the head of Vanderbilt's Hillel, and he has agreed to come and reprise his presentation that he did last month for Congregation Micah on the new government in Israel. So his talk is entitled Fourth Time's the Charm, What the New Government in Israel Means for the Present and the Future. Welcome, Ari. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Leslie and Deborah, for inviting me to do this. I'm always excited to talk about this stuff. I find it interesting and fascinating, if sometimes a little horrifying, but it's an important topic, and I'm so glad to be sharing my thoughts tonight. After being formally sworn in as ministers in Israel's new government, the leaders of the newly minted coalition posed for this picture with Israel's outgoing president, Reuven Rivlin. This picture displays a government of so many firsts. Rivlin's flanked on one side by Naftali Bennett, Israel's first Orthodox prime minister, and on the other by Yair Lapid, a secular centrist. Among those surrounding them are an Ethiopian-born minister, a former IDF chief of staff, Israel's first openly gay party leader, first Reform rabbi minister, first deaf minister, ministers explicitly representing the Arab community, immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and the most Arabs in Israel's history, as well as the most women in Israel's history. The government also includes the largest number of parties ever and the smallest ever party for a sitting prime minister. The 8-party coalition that unseated Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party is remarkable and improbable for so many reasons and in so many ways. Let's dive in and take a closer look at what happened and where Israel goes from here. But before we talk about the new government, let's talk a bit about the Israeli political system and how it differs from the United States. The United States political system is so partisan right now that we essentially have a straight line from liberal to conservative on just about every issue, with very little space for agreement and compromise in our two-party system. The Israeli parliamentary system is much more complex. And as a reminder for those unfamiliar with how Israel's parliamentary system works, voters vote for the party that they want in the elections, and then the top parties try to form a government by negotiating with other parties until they secure enough votes for a majority in the 120-seat Knesset. These coalition agreements form the basis of the government's agenda until internal disagreements and political calculations cause the government to fall, or 4.5 years pass, whichever comes first. Before this most recent election, there were at least 4 main axes upon which each party needed to be plotted: secular versus religious, socialist versus capitalist, the idea that peace is an achievable negotiating aim or that negotiations are impossible. And then over the last few years, a new axis has formed, the anti-Bibi versus pro-Bibi axis. For example, here's Labor, a secular negotiation-supporting socialist and anti-Bibi party, compared to Likud, a capitalist pro-Bibi party that believes there's no partner to negotiate with and is allied with the religious factions. Here's another example for you. Think about your personal opinion on mask mandates and lockdowns. And I know we'd all rather forget about COVID, but humor me for a moment. It's very likely that the party you personally identify with in Israel ideologically has an entirely opposite view on the coronavirus and how it should be handled than what you may think here in America. The Israeli system allows for greater diversity of parties and positions in all sorts of potential partnerships and clashes. This reality is still there, lurking under the surface, but it has been drowned out by the deafening noise of the Netanyahu debate. To be fair to Netanyahu, though, we ought to forgive him for feeling confident in the run-up to those elections in March. After all, Let's consider just what he had achieved over the previous 12 months. And note, I'm crediting Benjamin Netanyahu for all of these rather than the government or Likud more generally, because Netanyahu was careful to make sure that he was the central figure in making all of these things happen. He signed multiple normalization agreements with moderate Arab countries, reflecting the new consensus that an alliance with Israel against Iran and the benefits of open cooperation were more important than an insincere, symbolic, and self-destruction devotion to the Palestinian cause. He engineered a successful response to COVID that minimized infection, as well as rapid deployment of vaccines that made Israel the model and envy of the world. Netanyahu successfully fragmented and disillusioned his opposition, whether within Likud, within his governing coalition, or in the opposition, and made them essentially powerless. The Israeli Arab parties broke apart, which would make it harder for them to get enough votes to be in the Knesset. He even laid the groundwork to be able to bring one of those Arab parties into the government, giving himself both some wiggle room and another incredible diplomatic achievement. Success would likely mean an end to both the criminal trial that had dogged him for years, as well as a final victory over bitter rivals. As we all know, that isn't what happened. Bibi Netanyahu did not fully reckon with just how divided the country had become around his continued leadership and just how far his rivals would be willing to go to put an end to his reign, and what has happened with an Israeli electorate that has really come divided on the question of his leadership. And we now know that the Bibi question was the only question that truly mattered. All right, with the Bibi conversation out of the way, let's take a look at the makeup of the new Knesset. Let's run through what we have on the screen before we talk about it in a little more detail. I know there's a lot of information here. These are the parties that made it into the Knesset. The top left box has the party vote totals and the name of the party leader in parentheses. And the bottom left box has the breakdown by various ideological blocks. The parties highlighted in yellow ultimately joined the new government with the slimmest majority possible, 61 mandates, which is a fancy way of saying Knesset member votes. The blocks in green at the bottom are the two dominant blocks in the Knesset. Along the outside of the graphic is a descriptor of the parties in that slice, illustrating the ideologies of the various parties relative to the others. And I think this also powerfully illustrates the dynamics in play. The innermost of the concentric circles represent the political center. And as we move out, we go towards the relative extremes. Parties outside the last circle are not considered an acceptable part of mainstream political discourse, at least for now. And of course, the parties in question will hope that this will change. The solid vertical line in the middle represents the divide between the pro and anti-Netanyahu positions. The horizontal dotted line isn't as meaningful because 3 of these 4 squares are actually pro-status quo and generally agree on most everything but Benjamin Netanyahu. And to illustrate just how intense the anti-Bibi focus is, the parties written in red are led by people that have a personal animus towards and dislike of Bibi Netanyahu, either because they were forced out of Likud during power struggles or feel they were betrayed by him while serving in government with him. I'm using the term status quo as a shorthand for parties that are generally right-wing and supportive of Likud policies, regardless of whether they support Bibi. Now let's run through the various parties. We'll start at the top left and go clockwise. I'm not going to speak in detail about most of the individual parties because it would take a lot of time and it's all frankly really too complicated to easily keep track of, but feel free to ask me later if you're curious about a specific party. Suffice it to say that each party appeals to a specific slice of the electorate for specific reasons that distinguish it from the others on this list. Despite sitting in the same quarter of the circle, the parties in each section will not have the same platforms. In the pro-status quo, mostly secular and anti-Benjamin Netanyahu camp on the top left are Yamina, Yisrael Beitenu, New Hope, and Blue and White. Every one of these parties would be natural partners for a Likud led by anyone but Netanyahu. In the pro-status quo, pro-settler, and pro-Bibi camp are Likud, and then out past the fringe is religious Zionism. A brief word about religious Zionism. They used to be part of a faction with Yamina. After Yamina broke away from them, they added another party that is literally a Jewish Defense League Kahanis party and advocates Arab policies that are considered racist by most Israelis. They're a major reason why Likud was unable to form a government that leaned on the Arab party Ra'am, but we'll discuss that further in a bit. Below them, the pro-status quo, religious, and pro-Bibi camp on the bottom right are Shas, which represents Orthodox Sephardim, and United Torah Judaism, or UTJ, which represents Orthodox Ashkenazim. I'm going to use the term Haredi to describe these ultra-Orthodox parties, both because it's the term Israelis use and because I want to avoid implying that they are comparable to Orthodox movements in the United States. At the very bottom of the page, you'll also see Ra'am, an Islamist, nationalist, anti-Zionist party that has become the kingmaker of Israeli politics, which we'll discuss in detail shortly. I did want to note that they don't really fit anywhere on this chart because they aren't anti-Bibi, they aren't pro-status quo, and they are definitely religious. But again, that anti-Zionist thing is a little hard to ignore. And finally, on the bottom left, we have the anti-status quo, anti-Bibi pie slice comprised of Yesh Atid, Labor, Meretz, and then on the outskirts, the Joint List, which is a coalition of Arab parties that have little in common, save for the fact that they are Arab parties, they hate Bibi, and they are critical of Israel's policies towards Palestinians and Israeli Arabs. The previously mentioned Ra'am ran separately from the Joint List after having been part of it previously, because Ra'am proclaimed that Arab parties needed to seek to enter government, even if that means acquitting Netanyahu, and explicitly campaigned on that principle. Bibi Netanyahu got first crack at forming a government, and he failed because there simply weren't enough parties that were willing to negotiate with him. The only parties willing to talk to him were those on the right side of the circle above, so those on the right side of that solid line, plus Yamina. In theory, this would have actually been enough to form a coalition, but both Ra'am and religious Zionism refused to support a government that relied on the other in any way. Let me say that again in a different way. The only party within this attempted coalition that balked at sitting with an ultra-nationalist party considered racist by most Israelis was the Islamist one. And the only party that objected to the anti-Zionist Islamist party was the ultra-nationalist one. It's truly an extraordinary state of affairs, and it demonstrates just how far these parties were willing to go to remain in power. Before we leave this slide and explore the new governing coalition, I want to redirect your attention to that box on the bottom left of your screen. As we know, the Change bloc ended up forming the government, but it is critical to recognize that the far larger bloc in the Knesset is the right-wing bloc. American Jewry needs to come to grips with this reality. Israelis want a center-right, if not right-of-center government. Issues like the peace process and how to handle the Palestinians are not driving Israeli politics the way that we in America might imagine. These questions have been asked and answered by Israeli voters. To be clear, this does not mean the electorate is unwilling to make sacrifices and take risks for peace. They just want the decision to be made by the Israeli center-right on how to do it. The center-left segment of the government will likely prevent some of the right-wing politics that give Democrats in America heartburn. But we must remember that Bibi is arguably the most moderate member of the entire right-wing bloc, and that includes the parties that are now in government. There's a huge difference between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Prime Minister Bennett. The Israeli left that has put Bennett in charge may ultimately come to regret it. Here's an example of the difference, and this is a supposedly true, though certainly paraphrased story about Bibi and Bennett visiting the West Bank together. back when they were on better terms. While they stood on a West Bank mountaintop, Bibi says, "Look, you can see Tel Aviv from here. We can't give back this territory. Only 9 miles separate the coast from the West Bank. It's too dangerous." To which Bennett replied, "Forget the security concerns. These are the lands that Abraham walked. How could we ever give them up?" As this story illustrates, Bibi is a pragmatist that was willing to trade last year's annexation push for normalization with moderate Arab countries. I don't know that Naftali Bennett makes that trade. So after Likud failed, Yesh Atid got a chance to form the government, and they succeeded. The so-called change bloc they formed has literally nothing in common, save for a desire to get rid of Bibi Netanyahu as prime minister. The best thing I can say about the coalition's composition is it's less improbable ideologically than the one that Bibi Netanyahu tried to make. Yesh Atid started off banking on the support of Yisrael Beitenu, Blue and White, Labor, Meretz, and potentially both the Arab Joint List and Ra'am. That's 54 votes. The only way to get the remaining 7 votes was through Yamina and New Hope. Doing so cost them the votes of the Joint List, so that brought them to 62. Then one of Yamina's Knesset members announced that he would not vote for the government, bringing them down to 61, the bare minimum number needed. And that isn't all. One member of Yisrael Beitenu left the party because he was angry he wasn't given a ministry position, and one member of Ra'am abstained from the vote approving the government. It's not clear what will happen with any of these 3 MKs moving forward. All have indicated that they plan to support the government's legislative priorities in general, but not necessarily always. At least we know they haven't brought down the government, or they haven't done so yet. On the plus side, some portion of the Arab Joint List will support from the outside if it's needed, but it is hard to say for certain, and they announced their intention to vote against the government when the vote occurred. The issue here is somewhat performative. The Joint List would like to be in this government, at least some part of it would, if they could be, but it's a bridge too far for Yamina and New Hope, as well as, frankly, for the Joint List itself. The final tally on the vote to form the government was 60 in favor, 59 against, and 1 abstention, but at least 3 members of the Joint List held off voting against the government until it was crystal clear that doing so would not prevent it from having a majority. They would have abstained if they had to abstain in order for the government to pass. They are clearly unofficially supporting the government from the outside, at least for now. Let's look at how this new government shakes out in terms of which party got what. On the one hand, it's incredible that Yamina was able to parlay 5 seats into the first rotation prime minister slot. On the other, Yamina and New Hope were always a package deal, so really it was 17 for Yesh Atid and 12 for Yamina and New Hope, which is somewhat more reasonable. Also, Yesh Atid got the lion's share of ministries, the Knesset speakership, and the second turn as prime minister. The reality, though, is that most Israelis don't expect this government to last long enough for Yair Lapid, the head of Yesh Atid, to get his turn in the rotation, though Lapid and Bennett have a famously strong friendship, and there was definitely an effort to close off loopholes to avoid an early end. I think the Israeli political system is now in a race to see which happens first. The weight of the government's internal division kills it, or Likud abandons Bibi. Even with the best of intentions, it's impossible to predict what could happen in the future and when it happens. However, there are some obvious areas that could crop up, some obvious tensions or disruptions that could crop up and dramatically change the political dynamics, whether for better or for worse. Let's run through some of those now, though I do know that some of these might be a bit unsettling. Let's start with an easy one, and yes, that is doing some foreshadowing. Bibi's trial will probably end at some point during this government, assuming it doesn't fall early. Whether he's found guilty or innocent, it will set off a dramatic realignment of Israel's right-wing bloc. If he's found innocent, the rationale for alternative right-wing parties goes away, as they were ostensibly created out of a refusal to serve under an indicted prime minister. In that scenario, I can see New Hope and Yamina fracturing, with some returning to Likud and others remaining separate. Yisrael Beitenu would almost certainly remain separate from Likud, but could perhaps merge with Yamina or New Hope. If Bibi steps aside or is found guilty, things get even more unsettled. On the one hand, I could see most of the right-wing parties wanting to merge back into Likud. On the other, that will be tough to accomplish given the number of politicians that view themselves as the best option to be Bibi's successor. The most likely scenario, I think, is that there will be a consolidation of right-wing parties into 3 or 4 main parties that could then run as a united front, and afterwards unite under whomever emerges as the clear standard bearer of the right. On a less pleasant note, Hamas and Hezbollah are both client terror groups of Iran. Anything they do against Israel can be understood at some level as being at Iran's implicit or explicit request. Should conflicts arise, Ra'am won't share the Jewish party's impulse to unite in the face of terrorist or existential aggression. This means that Iran could, almost at a whim, cause a flare-up in Gaza or Lebanon that would at best destabilize this government and perhaps even force Ra'am out of government, which is an uncomfortable dynamic. At some point, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, will lose his grip on power. After all, he is 85 years old, in poor shape, and has a number of ailments that have not been publicly disclosed. He's also in the 17th year of a 4-year term. Who replaces him and how he's replaced will have lasting reverberations and will likely involve some degree of violence. We don't know when that will happen, but the how will likely determine the degree of violence. If there's a prearranged orderly transition to a designated successor, it may minimize the violence, but that would require Abbas actually naming a successor, which he has so far refused to do. If he dies in office, it's likely the various contenders will fight with each other for the honor of replacing him. Another possibility is that there would be a free-ish and fair-ish election for the post. Despite the occasional noise about Gaza and Gaza/West Bank reconciliation and a Palestinian election from time to time, this is unlikely to happen for the simple reason that the fractured and corrupt Palestinian Authority can't allow it to happen because Hamas would win. Another possibility is that Hamas engineers a West Bank coup like they did in Gaza. This would not be hard for them to accomplish. In fact, in a vacuum, Hamas could likely overtake the PA in a matter of hours. They don't live in a vacuum, though, and Israel will not allow Hamas to gain control over the West Bank and regularly works with the PA to prevent it. In the end, I think the most likely scenario will be that Abbas dies in power without a clear successor and things get bloody. I should also note that I'm not including the potential for an Arab Spring type popular uprising, such as the current protests against the PA, spiraling into an overthrow. I just don't see it as realistic unless it is in the context of one of the scenarios above. Even if everyone in the coalition prioritizes the need to avoid upsetting coalition partners, there are countless potential stressors that could force the coalition to fracture. The current issue I'm following carefully is the reunification law extension, which stipulates that Palestinians who marry Israelis, typically Arab, are not eligible for citizenship in Israel. To explain briefly, those on the left, as well as Arab parties, view this as racist, and those on the right believe it's necessary to prevent easy terrorist incursions. If every party voted based on values, it would pass despite losing coalition votes because most of the opposition would vote in favor. So far, the opposition has refused to support the bill to cause tension and embarrassment. How far will they go? I don't know. Can the coalition create some sort of miraculous compromise that brings enough parties to the table? I don't know that either, but my guess is that they'll eventually package it with an extension for something that the Haredi, the Orthodox parties need, and that will get it passed, but we'll see. Issues like this are tough enough, but the real challenge will be with Jewish building around the Jerusalem collar. Sheikh Jarrah is the most well-known issue and one of the causes of the May violence, but there are several potential flare-ups that are possible, and decisions will likely be made about them sometime in August. The government will hope that either the courts or the IDF prevents controversial building projects from moving forward, because if they don't, it is easy to see the government falling over this issue. So let's at least try to end this slide on a more pleasant note. One way that the government could be stabilized is through the inclusion of the Haredi parties. The addition of even a few of their 16 votes would make it very tough for this government to fall, though their inclusion would likely push other parties out, such as Yisrael Beitenu. This won't happen immediately if it happens at all. My guess is it would occur sometimes between 6 to 18 months from now in the context of the next budget process, the December 2022 budget. While I don't expect the peace process to be at the top of anyone's agenda, it has to be on everyone's list somewhere. A true opportunity for peace could easily split this coalition, or it can strengthen it dramatically. While I think it's far more likely to wreck the government than save it, I do want to throw out a concept that we as American Jews may need to wrestle with sooner than later. The fact is that for most Israelis, the two-state solution is dead. At best, Israelis push for the preservation of the possibility of a two-state solution at some mythical future date, but don't seriously entertain the notion that it is achievable at any point in the near future or the foreseeable future. This bizarre Frankenstein of a coalition just might be able to navigate these treacherous realities to craft a viable framework for a totally out-of-the-box alternative vision. Don't ask me what that vision is, because in the first place, I don't really know. And in the second, it would take a whole other lecture to lay out effectively. But perhaps some sort of commonwealth or federated system that avoids the separate but equal trap is possible. It would take a miraculous merging of the right's dream of West Bank annexation, the left's commitment to preserving democracy, the center's focus on remaining Jewish, and the Arabs' aspiration to achieve self-determination. This election process leaves us all with some big questions, which we will now look at in more detail. One of the benefits of a unity government is that as long as the various elements remain united around the reason for unity, a broad coalition government can accomplish a lot. As Bennett once explained, they must focus on the 70% they agree on and work on those areas, and leave the 30% they disagree on for a future government to address. Pay attention to how quickly and easily a new government is passed. They have 145 days to do so, or the government automatically falls and new elections are called. If this happens rapidly, it will be a good sign. If there's a long, contentious process that goes down to the wire, it should be cause for concern, especially if various parties use the budget as a proxy fight for other issues. Assuming they actually get it passed, I think this coalition will survive until at least December 2022, when the next budget is due. Since the government's formation, a variety of tensions and stressors have occurred that could have easily toppled the coalition if it was truly as fragile as it seems from the outside. There have been opportunities for those on the left, the right, and the Arabs to get angry and threaten the government. No one inside the coalition is doing so. And we aren't talking about little things either. There have been military exchanges between Israel and Hamas, a conference titled Occupation to Apartheid hosted by Knesset members, threats to destroy illegal buildings belonging to both Arabs in Israel and settlers in the West Bank, the failed effort to renew the family reunification law, which we just talked about, and none of these have derailed or even caused saber-rattling rhetoric between coalition members. Finally, the coalition is still finding its legs and making mistakes in a host of areas, and the opposition isn't going to make this easy or give them help. Netanyahu has convinced the opposition that it must oppose everything, and it's trying to make life as difficult as possible by gumming up the gears of government as much as possible. Obstruction is the name of the game. Assuming it survives, I think the government will get better at maneuvering around this, but for now, it's making everything hard. Assuming the new government won't be swiftly ripped apart by internal or external efforts to destabilize it. Likud will face some hard decisions around what to do with Netanyahu. Already, the wolves have circled and criticism is mounting. Major political figures within Likud and its allies, all Bibi loyalists that stayed with him till the bitter end, now openly acknowledge that the decision to do so cost them a stable governing coalition. Remember, it's a simple fact that if Bibi had stepped aside, the right-wing bloc would have easily formed a government that needed no compromises with the center, the left, or the Arabs. Bibi has no plans to go anywhere and has successfully consolidated power in order to demonstrate his continued dominance of his bloc. However, there's still a possibility for more defections from Likud, which the coalition is actively trying to facilitate. But all that pales in comparison to the impact losing will have on Bibi's corruption trial. Now that he's no longer prime minister, he can no longer leverage affairs of state to delay his trial or excuse his absence from it. The trial will start moving much, much faster than its previous snail's pace. This will have an impact politically and personally, especially while he's fighting to retain control of Likud. The longer he's in the opposition and the longer his trial lasts, the harder that will be unless he has unequivocally put down any internal opposition. Bibi does have a little bit of breathing room. His trial is taking a summer break and won't really get going in earnest until the high holidays. He probably needs the support of the government he probably needs the government to fall before that happens in order to minimize his issues. So this summer and early fall could get pretty interesting in that regard. Decades from now, everything about this election may be little more than a footnote, even the end of Bibi's uninterrupted reign as Israel's longest serving prime minister. Everything that is, except for the inclusion of Ra'am in the government. That will be reverberating long after the names of many members of this government have faded into memories. It is truly impossible to overstate the potential importance of this change. Even if the Arab parties hold the 10 to 15 seats in the Knesset that they have in the recent past, they can be the kingmakers in the way that the Haredim used to be. And I think that once Arab Israelis see how participating in government benefits them directly, they will reward parties that display an intention at the outset to do so, and they will be galvanized to vote. This will not only benefit all areas of the Arab Street as well as the Palestinians, but it will also help Israel deflect international criticism, since Arab participation in governmental decision-making undermines the argument that they are not free. We all tend to say Israeli when we mean Israeli Jews. I do it repeatedly in this talk. If Arab Israelis come to hold the 20% of the Knesset that they can stake a demographic claim to, it will not only remake Israeli politics and force a radical realignment of the political system, but it will also definitively change how we define the word Israeli. As with any election, there are always winners and losers. We all know which category Bibi Netanyahu is in. For Bibi, the Shakespearean tragedy of his situation is mind-blowing. After years spent rather ruthlessly cutting the legs out from any Likudnik that seemed a threat, those jilted proteges banded together to oust him. His fear of losing even a single right-wing vote led Bibi to personally forge a far-right partnership with racist undertones that was previously barred from running in elections. This deal with the devil allowed the very group he successfully got into government to derail his only chance to form a government dependent on Ra'am. After he made negotiating with Ra'am kosher, he had to watch Bennett and Lapid do what he could not and make the Arab Party the first to join Israel's governing coalition since its infancy. And finally, the dramatic reconception of a governing coalition that he engineered in order to woo Gantz into the last government was the key underpinning that allowed his opponents to finally unite and form a government without him. The immediate consequence of losing his hold on the prime minister's chair is a real blow to his self-image, reputation, and legacy. And as we already discussed, on top of dealing with this defeat, he has to simultaneously maintain his grip on Likud, stave off challengers, and defend himself in court. Bibi's going to have a challenging year or two. Naftali Bennett's a clear winner, but his victory does not come without peril. He finds himself in a tight spot with little room to maneuver. He's made his play and succeeded. He's the prime minister of Israel. Now he has to make the most of it. If the government fails, Yamina will almost certainly not make it into the next Knesset. 65% of Yamina voters opposed joining this government. In that scenario, merging with the triumphant Netanyahu is probably his best case scenario, but it is so tough for me to imagine Bibi giving Yamina that lifeline after all that has occurred. Standing on principle simply won't get him any credibility now either. He's pot committed, to use a gambling phrase, and needs to be able to point to a year or more of tangible achievements when there's another election. Ra'am and its leader, Mansour Abbas, are in a high-risk, high-reward situation, but at this point, I think they've gotten through the most risky period. Assuming that the budget gets passed, Ra'am will have proved that being part of the process pays off handsomely. They can successfully make the case to Arab voters that cooperation has benefits. Ra'am will be able to demonstrate significant gains around issues of vital importance to their constituents. Arab Israelis have been struggling with a massive crime problem, housing crises, and other issues that Ra'am will be able to show tangible progress around. And if the government does anything too problematic for Arab Israelis, Ra'am can be the hero, withdraw support, and cause it to immediately fall. In many ways, Ra'am is the domestic answer to the normalization agreements Israel recently signed. By contrast, the Joint List has a real potential problem. If Ra'am is comparable to the moderate Arab states, the Joint List could be characterized as the Palestinian Authority, powerless, obstructionist, and irrelevant to the ongoing realignment of the Middle East. For the last 3 elections, the inability to leverage the Arab parties as part of a governing coalition or prevent their entry into Knesset entirely is a big part of why Israel has been unable to form a successful government. We must also keep in mind that our preconceived notion of what an Arab party looks like is far from reality. American Jewry tends to lump Arab parties into a liberal bucket and assume that they support the causes that align with that position in the United States. This is a fantasy. For example, Ra'am is a religiously conservative Islamist party that rejects LGBTQ rights and women's rights and has far more policy priorities in common with the Jewish Haredi parties than other parties. Other Arab parties are hostile to Israel's existence and could be described as Hamas sympathizers. Some might be more in line with our notions of liberal, but none truly fit, save perhaps Hadash, a joint Jewish Arab party. As things stand now, the Joint List will have little to show their supporters in terms of tangible gain. The next time they vote, Arab Israelis will be choosing between Ra'am's list of tangible accomplishments and the Joint List's history of obstruction. I wouldn't want to be holding the Joint List cards right now. United Torah Judaism and Shas, the Haredi parties, have similar problems. In allying with Likud and Bibi, they cast aside decades of partnership with whichever party was able to form a government. This willingness to work with everyone allowed them to control many aspects of Israeli life, from kashrut to rabbinic ordination to conversion and beyond. It allowed them to direct huge sums of welfare support to the Haredim, eliminating the need for outside jobs, army service, secular education, and assimilation into wider Israeli society. In the recent past, on the few occasions that the Haredim were outside the ruling coalition, laws were passed that eroded these special benefits. This government will be no different, and the Haredim are not going to like many of its choices. Much of American Jewry, however, will love these changes, especially the reforming conservative movements, starting with the recent reestablishment of the egalitarian area of the Western Wall, but by no means ending there. If the government survives long enough to pass a budget, I think the Haredim will probably be begging to join in December 2022. Finally, there's Yair Lapid, the head of Yesh Atid. Despite being the prime minister bridesmaid once again, at least for now, Lapid has emerged in the strongest position of all. Most Israelis view him as the leader of the government and see him as the best alternative to Bibi. If the government survives, he'll become prime minister in 2 years and 3 months. If it doesn't, there are a world of new options that could open before him and bring him a stronger coalition in the next round of elections. Many pundits, including those on the far right, believe that if there is another round of voting soon, the center left will win the majority after all the recent upheavals, and he would probably be able to rely on Arab parties at that point as well. As we move to the conclusion of this talk, I want to look into a crystal ball and forecast some of the topics that we're likely to be discussing, assuming the government lasts long enough to realistically focus on these areas. Sorry, I messed that up. 1 second. The first order of business will be ensuring Israel is on track to recover economically from the pandemic, as well as the many unresolved issues that resulted from not passing a government budget for over 2 years. As we saw with the coronavirus and budget measures Biden got through Congress, a great deal of legislating can be done through the budget, and it will be no different in Israel. Those in the change bloc feel that Israel's democracy has been stressed by the upheaval of the last few years, and they're keen to fix what they believe Netanyahu broke. For many, the first order of business will be to prevent Netanyahu from regaining the prime minister's chair in the near future. They are considering 2 mechanisms to achieve this. First, by establishing a rule that bars individuals facing trial from running or serving as prime minister. Second, they may try to set a term limit of, say, 8 consecutive years as prime minister, after which one is barred from office. These ideas are in the early stages, and it isn't clear whether Yamina will support them, whether the Supreme Court would uphold them, and whether they could be made to apply to Bibi retroactively in any case. There are still several potential moderate Arab states that have not yet signed normalization agreements with Israel, but are considered low-hanging fruit, most notably states such as Oman, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. It isn't clear whether any of them are interested right now, however. I think that Lapid, as foreign minister, will focus on building relationships, but will wait until he takes over as prime minister to finalize any agreements so he can get full credit for the achievement. Instead, I think the next 2 years will be more focused on strengthening the warm peace with places like the UAE and turning the so-called cold peace with Jordan and Egypt into a warmer one. I do not expect there to be a major push around the peace process with the Palestinian Authority, though I did mention earlier in this talk, one earth-shaking way that could happen. More likely, the status quo will be maintained there, with the government aggressively trying to prevent changes that put strains on the coalition, and the opposition doing whatever it can to cause tension. And there will be lots of tension. New Hope and Yamina are going to feel constant pressure to show they are still right-wing parties, and Ram is going to be under just as much pressure to show it isn't collaborating with the enemy. Iran and the United States will almost certainly sign a new nuclear deal if they can accomplish it before August 3rd, when the hardliner Raisi takes over as president. If the agreement doesn't happen by then, it's quite possible it doesn't happen at all. So the Israelis will be focused on dragging things out if they can. I still expect the agreement to be signed, but I'm much less confident after some of the rhetoric in the last few days. It's hard to know for sure, but I think we're almost at the point where they might not even be able to get it done by August 3rd. While the new Israeli government will do some hand-wringing if it happens, I think it will avoid the actual military action that Netanyahu was constantly threatening, though the cyber attacks and sabotage will continue. The governing coalition will also focus on trying to convince Israelis that Bibi mismanaged the entire Iran nuclear situation, and whatever comes next is Bibi's fault. It's tough to predict what will happen with Hamas. On one hand, as long as Gaza gets regular payoffs from Qatar and Israel doesn't make moves to prevent that, they will probably avoid new conflicts in the short term. And assuming no provocation, the new Israeli government will not try to disrupt the status quo. The wild card here is that Hamas feels it achieved many of its goals in the last conflict, almost all of which had to do with making the Palestinian Authority look bad and staking Hamas's claim to be the true leaders of the Palestinian people. This may embolden them to reinitiate hostilities, especially if they have the added incentive of being able to collapse Israel's government in the bargain. Before we get to questions, I thought I'd make some predictions about what will happen next, assuming the new government does manage to pass a budget this year. If any of these come true, feel free to applaud my brilliant predictions and ignore any that go titanically awry, since I labeled them as just for fun. Also look past the fact that some of these are mutually exclusive. Serving as prime minister of a coalition that includes left of center parties and an Arab party is not the same as serving under a center left government. The December 2022 budget negotiation will be when things truly get settled or fall apart. If the Haredi parties join, it will stabilize the government and give Bennett the cover he needs to stay in it. If not, the budget process gives everyone a principled excuse for new elections. If the government is going to fall, I think it will be over a clear red meat issue that everyone can use to inspire voters, such as the settlements, rather than something mundane or nuanced. Shaked is the other leader of Yamina and is a powerhouse in her own right with legitimate prime ministerial aspirations of her own. Having her take over from Bennett in the next election, either because the coalition agreement preventing Bennett to stay or to pacify voters who are mad at Yamina, is a smart move if the government doesn't survive long term. Something has to give within the right-wing bloc, and I think that the next election is when that happens. Without the urgency of deposing Netanyahu, I do not think voters will continue to support a fragmented right. If they don't consolidate, they have to make a clear argument for their continued existence, or they won't make it into the next Knesset. If Bibi loses his grip on Likud, there will be nothing separating the right-wing bloc from a governing coalition, save infighting over who is in charge and the bromance between Lapid and Bennett. Arab parties are going to have to readjust their platforms and campaign strategies to fit with whatever happens with Ra'am. I think the Ra'am experiment will be considered a success by many Arab voters, and this will lead to a realignment of the parties, the Arab parties, making those that intend to participate in a governing coalition key components of future coalitions. Whether it happens because he manages to keep this coalition together until it's his turn, or because voters give him the mandates to form a government in the next election, I think Yair Lapid will be the next prime minister. And finally, I think that Bibi will be found innocent in his trial, and whether they love him or hate him, I think Israeli voters are going to have to again reckon with an exonerated Bibi, one way or the other. Thank you so much for letting me talk about this today. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Ari. That was a lot to process, and we should definitely take side bets on whether Netanyahu gets acquitted or not. That would be an interesting pool for the community. I think Michal wants to ask the first question.
Hi, Ari. Sorry for being in the dark. Sorry. Shushi, die. Sorry. So, a few things and try to avoid the background noise. I wanted to congratulate you. The main reason I joined tonight was that I always find it amusing to see Americans trying to explain the parliamentary system. And you did a great job, like really one of the best I've seen. So
thank you so much. Thank you. That's high praise. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So I don't have questions, just like a couple of comments, if you don't mind. Is that at the beginning of the talk, you talked a lot about what in a way the glue, and that's true, the main glue that connects all those parties together are just anti-Bibi. But I think what they are, and like they're even realizing it more now, that it's not only anti-Bibi, it's also what Bibi brought to the Israeli politics and what he made out of the Likud. And if you want, you can compare it a bit about what's going on with Trump and the Republican Party. Like he brought all these people who were like, I'm sorry, like apart from being corrupt, but they're like also like they don't came to the government to govern. They, Miri Regev, David Amsalem, David Biton, all these people who are like really like were there because Bibi took advantage of them because he knew they're not gonna come against him. And in the meantime, while there were like, you know, some of them were like ministers in the government, they totally destroyed or like they left ruins after them in the different offices, like the culture offices, finance, not to say the Ministry of External Affairs. I don't know, I forgot my English. So, so all those, like, you know, now they're coming, it's really like, you know, the Maccabim who came to the Bet HaMikdash, they come, it's like it's everything is burned and they have to start from the beginning. So what I'm saying is like, I think my interpretation is that now it's not only about anti-Bibi, it's really like about the fact that they're like want to present themselves as the people who like, who, as you said, save the democracy, but also save the government. Like, I'm gonna put on mute now.
Thank you. I think a lot of what you said makes sense. I'll note one of the benefits of a parliamentary system in theory is that because it's so nimble and frequently changes, you don't have the kind of stasis that can set in when there aren't changes in government. And the Likud success and Bibi's success at remaining in power for as long as he did makes it really challenging for that issue. And you'd see that whoever was in government, and even in America, when you have a president who's around for 8 years, by the end of that 8th year, you often see the same kind of dynamic where things aren't necessarily happening in the way that they were happening because the government has been in power for a while. But yes, the finding things to unite around is the key to survival for this coalition, and especially if Netanyahu exits the stage sooner than later, trying to remain with things that they are agreeing on is going to be very important.
Ari, can you talk to us a little bit more about the issues at the wall and the egalitarian section? So what is Bennett's agenda in supporting, you know, because traditionally that party wouldn't, or his coalition wouldn't be supportive of promoting the egalitarianism there. So what's his agenda, do you think, in at least signaling that he might be receptive?
So Bennett's not simply someone who's paying lip service to the egalitarian wall. We should give credit where it's due and note that Bennett was in charge of the ministry that set up that agreement in a previous government, and it was only later that it got sidetracked and wasn't really in effect for a little while. Bennett spent much of his life in America. He has American parents, I think. He's got a strong connection. He understands diaspora Jewry in important ways. And I think that he understands that this is important. It's also as one of those other things that much of the government can unite around is sticking it to the Haredim parties. And this is something that they really don't like. So several of the parties are really excited to do it just to tick off the Haredi. And as we saw a couple days ago with the storming of the egalitarian area, it's going to be a hot spot and it's going to be a controversial issue. But I do think that Bennett is going to remain very consistent in advocating for its support. The problem is going to be that the people who are opposed to it want the pictures and the images of police forcing them out of that area. and the government will not want those pictures. So the question is, what will the government decide? Will allow them to keep interrupting, or will the government prevent them from doing so and deal with the optics of that? One way or the other, they're going to have an optics issue.
That was going to be my follow-up, is what happens when they have to actually call the police in to drag these people away. So if you were betting, do you think Bennett is going to do that, or is he going to stop short of that and let the law be what it is, but let the harassment continue?
I think they will do their best to find a way to avoid it. To avoid those optics. It's a lot easier to keep people out than it is to remove them. And we might see an effort to keep people out. To be fair, however, we should note that for the last however many years, the only people in that area were the Haredi. They were the only people who were really using that area, and some of them have gotten accustomed to being there. It is open to everyone, and there is going to need to be some adjustment. But it would be hard to make the claim that that is why they're doing what they're doing, just as it would be hard to make the claim that if the women of the wall try to go into the women's section away from the egalitarian area, if they try to do their praying in the women's section, they would also similarly be doing so with an intention and a purpose that wouldn't be present if they did that prayer at the egalitarian section.
Other questions? You can unmute yourselves and ask.
Sure. So Ari, I'll continue with the being a betting man. Curious your instinct. Do you think that Yair Lapid has a greater chance of becoming the next prime minister through the rotation with Bennett, or through new elections and that he becomes the one who gets the mandate?
Bennett and Lapid have a really special relationship, and not necessarily an alliance. They don't agree, and their parties definitely don't agree on a lot of issues, but there is real trust and a real connection and a real bond between them. It's hard to answer. I will note that one of the primary loopholes that was put into the coalition agreement in an effort to stop Bennett from bolting was, when his term was up, was a stipulation that he couldn't serve in any capacity until after the next government. So theoretically, Bennett could go to after 2 years, Bennett could go to Likud and say, okay, let's make a new government. I was going to move into defense minister. Let me be defense minister under Netanyahu, and that's fine. And we don't need to have a new election. And there was a stipulation that prevented him from doing that in the coalition agreement, which actually was removed, and by Yesh Atid. They said, you know what, we don't need that. So I think part of it's going to depend on what those two men get together and decide they want. That said, it would also depend on the reality on the ground. If Yesh Atid believes that they have an opportunity to get substantially more votes in the Knesset, they might roll the dice on that. But until there's a reason not to, I would say, and I just said a lot of words, and now I'll give you my bet. The Yesh Atid and Yamina have too much at stake to stay in government to abandon it unless they have to.
Ari, God, I love listening to you.
Thank you.
I have a little bit more optimism than you do. I see this coalition as disparate as it is, giving Israelis hope that there's a better set of checks and balances to some of the mistakes Israel has known to have made in the past. And that gives me pause for big, and I agree. I don't expect in my lifetime to see the Berlin Wall come down, but I do see proactive steps being taken that could lead to something better than what we have now down the road. And that might include a shift in how we treat people in the West Bank. It might be more talks, even through third parties with Hamas. Could be a whole variety of things. I love the idea of a confederation. I think that gives promise. But I just don't want to fall into the camp that says peace can never happen. And what do we tell our kids if we believe that we're going to continue with this mess? I don't know how you're going to deal with the kids in the fall. I'm real curious about your thinking about that. But Deb and Leslie are bringing a young man to town in a couple weeks who really speaks to the bad job we've done raising our kids to understand the realities on the ground and the truth. And you know, I don't envy your fall coming back. I know you're going to have a handful, but you could hardly blame our kids for looking at the situation critically. So I'm sitting with more hope. I'm hoping that a Biden administration, a Lapid, even a Bennett, who's a reasonable person, is going to take the steps that we need to see to make the future a little brighter.
Well, you know, I do keep asking Eric if he'll trade jobs with me for 6 months, but he refuses. I'm not looking forward to the fall either. It's going to be a challenging year for sure. It's not that I think hope is impossible. In the first place, I think that this government right now is committing a lot of unforced errors. A couple days ago, the Speaker of the Knesset accidentally voted no on a bill that caused it to fail, and the family reunification bill, whether you like it or you don't like it, they didn't realize that the opposition was going to vote against it as a unified bloc, and they were kind of surprised by that. These are unforced errors, and if they're going to take on something truly ambitious, like trying to solve the issues related to the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority, they're going to have to be a whole lot more accomplished as legislators than they are right now. And I'm not saying that won't happen in time. And in fact, I think it will. I think, I don't know, I haven't seen this written anywhere, so I hesitate to really talk about it explicitly, but there are some extensions coming up that the Haredim are going to need for their budget-wise for money that's going to go to them. And if I were Bennett and Lapid, I'd be going to the Haredi parties and saying, look, we know you want this money. You want this extension. We will give it to you as part of doing all these other things that we need to happen. And if they can accomplish that, it's going to be the first real crack in the opposition with Netanyahu. And similarly, if they can just get through December, if they can get that budget passed, we're into January now, if they can get that budget passed, they are going to probably be around for a while, and that's going to really put a lot of pressure on the opposition. It's going to put a lot of pressure on Bibi. But if he does step aside, or if something happens with the trial, or any of a number of other things, it just it's easy to imagine the coalition fracturing than it is to imagine it staying together through whether they're intense opportunity or intense challenge. And if there's a realignment needed, there is no place to get those votes without the government following outside of the Haredim. And why would the Haredim have gone for so many years of sitting in with Bibi and refusing to negotiate if they were only then going to stop when something happens?
Michal, last question.
It's actually a response. Two things. First, Avi, I think we all need to remember that people in Israel, as sad as it is, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's not their priority right now and hasn't been the last 2 decades. What they care about is really like the Haredim, the economic situation, the inequality, cost of living. So no one will actually push their leaders to do anything about that until the other things are solved, and that will take a long time. And to the Haredim issue, I'm more optimistic than you, Ari, about the future of this government, and I'm not an optimistic person, and I do not believe in it. But I do think that there are, like, especially after COVID, there are all those things like Haredim, like the problem of religion in Israel got even more extreme an issue than it was before. And I don't think that Bennett and Lapid, and not to say Lieberman, will rush giving budget to the Haredim, as we saw what Lieberman did just a few weeks ago, that he actually took some child credit stuff from them. So especially after COVID, especially about how like Netanyahu, and another thing I disagree with your Netanyahu accomplishment, not COVID, I would not put it there, especially because of the reason that Netanyahu gave in to the Haredim and their political power, and that giving in caused 2 outbreaks in Israel, and not getting into the Meron stuff. So what I'm saying is that I don't think the coalition has a lot of interest to go after the Haredim. And second, I also think the Haredi leadership is losing their grasp in their population after COVID and after the disaster that happened in Meron. So yeah.
Yes, the UTJ and Shas are in for some real challenges. They do not have a strong hand right now if they stay in the opposition. On the plus side for them, they did build in a 6-month or a year advance. So all of the money that's supposed to go to them, they got this deal that says they get the money and it's guaranteed in advance. So they actually aren't going to experience financial issues for a good year, which is why I continue to say it's the December 2022 budget where they're going to be feeling the pinch, where they're going to come to the table. And I just don't think it's going to happen much before that. That right now they have nothing to lose by staying in Bibi's pocket, and I shouldn't say pocket. I don't mean to imply a bribe. That by staying attached to him, and they can afford to wait and see if this government survives. I will, however, Michal, say that everything that you just said may be right on. And there are plenty of pollsters and people who say if there was another election now, the Israeli right would have a much harder time and they would do much more poorly than they did in the last election. The problem that this government will have to face is that there will need to be another election in order for the observations that you just made to punish the Haredi at the polls. Because right now they have the seats they have. And unless people don't vote for them in the next election, it's not going to come back to bite them. Now, maybe Likud splinters. Maybe there's the factions within Likud that pull away and move over to New Hope or to make a new party or something, because that rule was passed. But I just think that it's going to be hard to navigate that. And again, maybe if it happens after a year or 2 years where these guys understand better how to do things, it'll be easier. I think it's when Yair Lapid was in government with Bibi Netanyahu, he was very proud of all of the minister positions that he got in that government negotiation, not understanding that in doing it, he gave up all of the chairmanships in the Knesset. And so when Bibi fired him from the party, from the government, he suddenly found he had no control. And he may have learned lessons from that experience and how to construct things. And it seems like, I think it's worth noting, it seems like he's gotten a much tighter control on the Knesset piece of things. But we'll see. We'll see. They need some quiet in order for the hope to build and the trust to build. And to get to that quiet, they need to pass the budget.
Two other observations real quick. They are making mistakes, but they're a new coalition and they're going to have to find their way. But already the Arab Joint List is looking at supporting the passage of the budget, and that's a good sign. The other thing that seems to be an unknown is what the electorate's going to look like ahead. I mean, my nephew that's going into the Air Force in August, I asked him what his friends talk about. And the kids going into service are kids who were born after 2000. And they're not coming from that generation before that has this steep experience. They don't even know their own history, like our kids don't know their own history. What they do know is they don't want to stand in the West Bank and shoot guns at Palestinian kids their age. It's going to be a whole new, it'll be interesting to see how this younger generation that wants peace and quiet is going to evolve politically. It's an unknown. Michal,
Right.
what are you hearing from young people?
I'm not young anymore.
I know you're not, but you're closer to them than I am.
Well, I don't want to hold everyone. It's a bit late, but what I think is like what you said about the nephew, that they don't want to shoot other kids in the West Bank. I think that unfortunately there are enough young people who were born after 2000 who all they know is that, exploding buses and exploding restaurants. So their affection and their ability to feel some empathy to the other side is much, much lower than your nephew. So that's bad news.
All right. I do want to be respectful of Ari's time, especially since tonight is his last night without kids. They're coming back from camp tomorrow. So thank you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. It was very informative, and we're going to put it up on YouTube for those who weren't able to join tonight. And we'll touch base with you in a few months and see how all of these predictions have come out. And in the meantime, we'll all cross our fingers for the budget to pass.
Ari, I sent you the blog that Oren Jacobson wrote. I don't know if you've seen it, but I'd love to hear it another time.
I look forward to it. I know I owe you a lunch.
Okay.
All right. Thanks again.
Thank you,
Good night,
Ari.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ari. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.